Started with our committee meeting for today. I am told that today could be a full hour, so we don't want to delay in getting started. We only have one item on the agenda, and that is a hearing on House Bill 2607. And so we will open up the hearing on 2607, and we will start with an overview from our reviser. Reviser Lawrence, welcome to the committee. We're anxious to hear what you have to say to us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, committee. House Bill 2607 would amend the Kansas pesticide laws in a number of ways. This is one of those bills that has a lot going on, so please bear with me as we go through it. The bill provides requirements for the training and supervision of uncertified applicators. Section 1 would require pesticide business licensees and private applicators to provide appropriate supervision and training for uncertified applicators who apply restricted use pesticides. Each pesticide business licensee would be required to maintain records to verify that that business's uncertified applicators have been properly trained. The Secretary of Agriculture would be authorized to adopt rules and regulations on proper supervision and training of uncertified applicators, and the records and the requirements for those records on the training of uncertified applicators. Section 4 of the bill would require direct supervision of registered pest control technicians when applying restricted use pesticides. Section 2 of the bill provides definitions for relevant terms used throughout the bill, including changes in this bill for the terms certified private applicator and government or governmental agency. Section 3 concerns pesticide business licensee requirements and would require applicants to file a surety bond or certificate of liability insurance instead of a letter of credit or proof of an escrow account, which is what is currently in law. Section 3 would also require government agencies to be issued a government agency registration before applying pesticides in the sodium cyanide predator category. Applications of such pesticides would be required to have certification to apply those pesticides. Government agency registrants would also not be required to provide proof of financial responsibility under the Act. Sections 5 and 14 address penalties for violations of the law. Currently, the law provides civil penalties for pesticide business licensees or pesticide dealers who violate the Kansas pesticide law. But Section 5 would provide that any person who violates the law would be subject to a civil penalty. The maximum fine for such violations could not exceed $500, and in the case of a continuing violation, the total maximum fine could not exceed $2,500. And additionally, for the criminal penalties, Section 14 would provide that any person, including certified private applicators, who violate or fail to comply with the pesticide law or rules and regulations adopted thereunder would be guilty of a Class A misdemeanor. For categories of certification, Section 6 of the bill would allow certified commercial applicators at the discretion of the Secretary to obtain additional certification in other categories or subcategories. This provision would expire on December 31st of 2028. Additionally, the Secretary may allow government agency applicators certification in the category of sodium cyanide predator control. Section 7 of the bill would add to the categories of qualification for certification and licensing sodium cyanide predator control, aerial pest control, and soil fumigation. Section 8 of the bill concerns certified private applicators and would require that certificates for private applicators may only be issued to individuals who are at least 18 years old. Restricted use pesticides could only be used by either certified applicators or uncertified private applicators under the supervision of a certified applicator. If the uncertified applicator is directly supervised by a family member or relative and applying the pesticides on that family member or relative's property, the applicator may be 17 years old. Private applicator certification would not be authorized in certain categories, and you can see those listed on page 11 starting in line 35. But those applicators could obtain commercial applicator certification in any categories except the sodium cyanide predator control. Certified private applicators would still be required to pass a written exam, except the bill does allow the Secretary to adopt rules and regulations to establish a training program as an alternative to the written exam. Such applicators would be subject to testing or training fees established in rules and regulations in an amount not to exceed $75. Section 9 of the bill provides that in lieu of a private applicator exam, certification renewal could be achieved by satisfactory completion of a training course and a recertification by training fee of up to $50. Sections 10 and 12 would amend the requirements for proof of financial responsibility to allow use of a certificate of liability insurance or a surety bond of at least $6,000 and would require rules and regulations be promulgated for such proof of financial responsibility. Sections 11 and 16 would provide that denial, suspension, revocation, or modification of licenses would only apply for violations of Kansas pesticide law and Kansas chemigation safety law, and not to general convictions or guilty pleas for violations of other state or federal laws that aren't related to pesticides or chemigation systems. Section 13 of the bill would require written statements for services, include the license number of the pesticide business licensee and the applicator's certification number. Additionally, government agencies would be required to maintain records relating to each application of pesticide. The requirements for those records are on pages 18 and 19 of the bill. That is the highlights. I know highlights might be an interesting word choice there, but then those are the highlights of the bill. So thank you for sticking with me through that. The last thing I will say is that House Bill 2607 did pass the House as amended by House Committee on a vote of 118 to 1, and it would take effect on July 1st upon publication in the statute book. And I will do my best to answer your questions.
Thank you for that overview. And committee, a lot of times when we have an overview, they're fairly brief, but you can see this bill has a lot of sections to it. I will ask one question of yourself, and you may not know the answer, and that's fine. If you don't, then a conferee can answer it. But again, I always prefer to ask the questions for the first one, so then others can be prepared to answer. In Section 6, the provisions of Section 6B expire on July the 31st, 2028, which is new language, but do you have any understanding why the House or why the bill was written with that expiration date in there?
I will not answer the why questions, but I'm hoping someone behind me will be able to do so.
That's what I figured.
Yeah.
Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Direct supervision. There was always I was in this racket for a while, and direct supervision had different meanings. Does that mean we can talk by phone, or does direct supervision mean the person has to be actually on site?
So I'm not seeing a definition for the term direct supervision, so I would defer to the agency on their interpretation of what that means, since they are the ones who have to implement this section of law.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Tamara. Are these guidelines coming from USDA, or and who's requesting these, and what kind of mandates does it put on like our county agencies?
It's my understanding that there were changes to the EPA rules and regulations that led to some of the changes in this bill, but I will defer to the agencies to go into a little bit more detail on what those changes were, why that happened, and the impact they foresee on local government entities.
Further questions of our reviser? Seeing none, thank you. We will start with our first conferee, which is from the Kansas Department of Agriculture. We have with us Deputy Director Kelsey Olson. Deputy Director, welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Chairman and members of the committee. I am Kelsey Olson. I serve as the Deputy Secretary at the Kansas Department of Agriculture. First off, thank you for the opportunity to come here before you and testify on House Bill 2607. As the reviser noted, it is quite a lengthy bill and has quite a bit of technical components to it. So I will do my best to walk you through the agency's perspective and then try to answer any questions that you may have. So the Kansas Department of Agriculture is the authorized entity to enforce all applicable pesticide use in Kansas. This includes the licensure of pesticide businesses and dealers and the requirements associated with the training and certification of pesticide applicators. Because of this, KDA maintains the primacy for enforcement for the Federal Insecticide, Rodenticide, and Fungicide Act, otherwise known as FIFRA. House Bill 2607 proposes updates in order to maintain the state's primacy over our pesticide regulation, as well as updating the financial responsibility and reducing the restrictions on eligible pesticide applicators and employees. In 2017, the Environmental Protection Agency updated the regulations regarding the certification of pesticide applicators. This was to ensure that all states and tribes have consistent standards over any person or entity that applies restricted use pesticides, or RUPs, which can only be applied by a certified pesticide applicator or individuals under their supervision, but not by the general public. There are 4 key components to the overall 2017 EPA rule. One was to enhance the requirements for applicator education and safety, the required specialized certifications for people using specific application methods, and then to establish a national minimum age for certified pesticide applicators who use or supervise the use of RUPs. And then lastly, updates to the required mandatory training of uncertified applicators and record-keeping requirements for the training. One of the major components of this legislation is simply to include all persons and entities that apply restricted use pesticides. Having all pesticide applicators follow the same standard is an important to the state of Kansas to ensure that there is ensure the products are being safely applied, and reducing the potential damage to others' properties is an important element of this as well. It's also to ensure the protection of those applicators who are applying these products. All states and territories are required to comply with the 2017 EPA's rule. All states and territories had until November of 2023 to submit a proposed state plan as to how the state would adopt and integrate the new standards of the EPA's expectations. KDA submitted the plan in the fall of 2023 and was approved. House Bill 2607 is the first step in implementing that state plan to update our state pesticide regulations. The first big component that I want to talk to you about is the civil penalty authority. Currently, KDA only has civil penalty authority over pesticide businesses if they are found to be in violation of any of the Kansas pesticide law. The civil penalty authority over individuals is a required component of the EPA in order for KDA to maintain the FIFRA primacy for Kansas. 2607 extends that authority from pesticide businesses to any person or entity that would be found in violation of the pesticide law. Under our current law today, civil penalties must be an amount not less of $100, but no more than $1,000. Well, of course, the agency strives to ensure that there are not violations made. There have been situations in the past where violations have occurred. The agency, in some cases, has been unable to pursue civil penalty due to the limited authority over only pesticide businesses. When this bill was heard on the House Ag Committee side, there was an amendment made to the bill, which we viewed as favorable, but we would offer a suggested potential change. So there was, the change was made to limit the penalties from not less than $100 to no more than $500 per violation, and provided a maximum civil penalty for continuing violations to not exceed $2,500. While we're happy to see this amendment come forward, we would ask that you would consider providing a separation of civil penalty authority amounts between businesses and individuals, which the current amendment does not allow for that. But we would just ask that we consider the flexibility to have that authority so that there may be varying severity levels of violations that we would want to consider, and then also ensuring that businesses and individual applicators would simply not choose payment of a violation over adhering to the law that is set forth in this act. Regarding education and training requirements, 2607 enhances the requirements, as I indicated, to comply with the EPA. The certified private applicators would be required to pass a closed book examination in order to certify their eligibility of using RUPs. It also establishes the requirements to allow certified applicators to obtain initial certification through an alternative training program in lieu of a written book option, which is a mandatory option for the EPA. We believe that certified private applicators would still remain in effect for 5 years. That would not be changing, and then they would be able to be recertified either through the closed book process or through attending a recertification training program as well. As it was indicated on the House side, this provides some flexibility for individuals who might not be comfortable with a closed book exam, but the in-training option is a good alternative, as we tried to strive for finding a meaningful way to administer this within Kansas. It also provides for that certified applicators, both commercial and private applicators, must properly supervise uncertified applicators. There is rules and regulation authority for KDA to further spell out what that certification looks like and the requirements that would be needed for the documentation and the maintenance of any training records that would be related to those supervisions. Record keeping is also a key component to these updates. Label requirements for restricted use pesticides have changed significantly over the years. We are now seeing wind conditions, temperature limits, even specifications for the equipment that a product can be applied with, all part of the label that is required on some of our restricted use pesticides. So record keeping is a critical and essential element to the overall Pesticide Act, making sure that this is, if there is any complaint that is made against a state government agency, against a pesticide business or certified applicator, agencies will be required to have the additional information as part of their record keeping documentation. KDA would then verify those documents in case of a complaint situation where there was question as to whether or not the product had been applied according to the label. It's also worth noting 2607, our current pesticide law has a number of different categories in how and what kind of categories a business can be certified in. This 2607 provides for some additional categories as well as streamline some of the current categories. So we do have additional categories for aerial pest control, soil fumigation, and sodium cyanide predator control, which is a unique component for this bill. Kansas currently has restrictions pertaining to sodium cyanide. However, the EPA required that each state address the use of those products within their state plan and within their laws. So KDA worked with our other agencies to ensure that this bill language is not only sufficient for the EPA requirements, but falls within the existing laws that relate to sodium cyanide predator control. An additional special certification category is in regards to sodium fluoracetate predator control. KDA did not include this as a certification category. However, it is unclear that the certification is consistent for private applicators and certified commercial certification and business licensure. So KDA does request that this committee consider an amendment to Section 7 that would include language prohibiting such certification and licensure, similar to the language that we proposed prohibiting private applicator certification, which is in Section 8, subsection C3. Excuse me. And lastly, the last two components that I wanted to talk about. In 2020, KDA proposed House Bill 2463, which was a bill that revised existing requirements of pesticide businesses. Given the state of the world in 2020, that bill passed through the House, but did not ever make it to the Senate and was not picked up in the condensed time frame. We have proposed a couple changes in this bill that would consume those elements that we had brought forward in 2020. The first of it being the provisions regarding permitting proof of financial responsibility, and in presenting either a certificate of liability insurance or the proof of possession of a surety bond. The Natural Resources Ag Committee on the House side made amendment to that, which we saw as friendly, but we would just ask for a technical inclusion to add in section 10, subparagraph B2, the reference of surety bonds to clarify that the liability insurance or the surety bond be in place by January 1st of 2025. Yeah, we'll keep going. And then the second component of that is under current pesticide law, KDA is prohibited from awarding anyone a licensure for pesticide application who has been convicted of a felony, but the language actually says that we need to, KDA has the ability to sufficiently determine whether someone has been rehabilitated prior or following the arrest of that situation. We do not feel that it is appropriate, nor does KDA have the statutory authority to conduct background checks on individuals. So this is a self-reporting component of it, and we have requested that language simply be removed from the bill, so that it does not put our program in a unique situation of trying to determine whether or not someone has been subsequently rehabilitated following a felony situation. Overall, we appreciate your consideration of 2607. There are many elements of this bill that the Kansas pesticide law is looking to establish in order to maintain the standards set forth by the EPA. And we look forward to working with you and hope that you would continue working this bill on behalf of the agency. So with that, I would stand for any questions, and I'm also happy to address the first couple questions that have come forth if you would so desire. Okay.
And address those questions, please.
Certainly. So Chairman, your question regarding section 6B, the timeline on the adjustment to categories. So I mentioned that there are a number of categories and licensures that currently exist, but we are transitioning to a more limited, broader categories. And so that timeline is to allow for the transition of those who are currently licensed to go through the next phase as we bring in the new categories. So it is by design, fits within our licensing timelines and the renewal periods that are established, but it goes from we have multiple 1A, 1B, 1Cs, 2As, Bs, and those are then simplified under the new standards. And so that allows that transition to happen for those licensees as seamless as possible, ideally. And then to Senator Dahl's question regarding direct supervision, I really hate to say it, but the answer is it depends. There are some labels for restricted use pesticides that require direct supervision to be in line of sight, and then there are others that just allow for a broader use of direct supervision. KDA has tried to provide as much flexibility there, and in some regards, as long as there's a form of communication, albeit the phone or speaking across the field or on a handheld, we believe that is considered in direct supervision as long as the label allows for that type of supervision. So additionally, other questions, happy to answer as they may come.
You said the EPA in January of 2017 made some changes. And Kansas did not submit a proposal until November of 23, which must have been or that November was when they had to have had it. You submitted it probably a few months before, a few weeks. When, in the department's opinion, does this need to be implemented in order to keep EPA at bay?
So part of our state plan that we submitted was a timeline of implementation. And the first step of implementation is passing a bill that will update our state pesticide law. Our total implementation plan, based on the licensing periods that we have, we would not be fully implemented until 2030. So the EPA, as of right now, they see us taking steps to fully implement this plan. If there's changes, if there are amendments made to the bill that would potentially put us outside of the proposed plan that we have submitted, we would have to go back to the EPA, seek approval again for our state plan, and then start the process over. So we are in the implementation process, and updating our pesticide law is part of that process.
All right, thank you. Senator Dahl.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony. Who enforces these regulations? You drive through southwest Kansas and you see spray everywhere. You see lawn people. And back in the day, I think there was one dude that was in charge of all of that. Is that how it is still?
Thank you, Senator. We have a pesticide program, and with me today, I failed to mention, is Kelly Novinsky-Wenzel. She is our program manager for the pesticide program at KDA, and she has a team of staff that are scattered across the state that have inspectors stationed across the state. There's a team in the office that review pesticide labels, and then there's also an enforcement component to the program that oversees the enforcement when there are complaints. It is a complaint-driven program, so I mean, we are out there, we do make routine inspections, but then also respond to complaints as arise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You have a team. How big is the team, like in southwest Kansas, for example?
May I defer to our program manager to respond to that question?
That's fine.
Okay.
Forward, identify yourself for the record, please, and answer the question.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Kelly Novinsky-Wenzel, and I am the Pesticide and Fertilizer Program Manager for the Kansas Department of Agriculture. And currently, I have 11 field staff across the state of Kansas. And so each individual has a unique territory that they cover. When it comes to kind of routine inspections, we do try and go out and do what we call ag uses, where we try and find individuals, businesses primarily, in the act of making an application to ensure compliance in that way. We also do the same thing for non-agriculture uses. And those inspections are typically negotiated through our cooperative agreement with the EPA. And then our complaints, where we have someone that says, I was drifted on, what we do in those cases is we do have a system in place where they come in, we contact the individual, we assign that out for investigation. We try and keep it in territories, but depending on how busy an area is, sometimes one of my folks has to go out of the territory in order to investigate. I also have 2 compliance supervisors that do also help with complaints and inspections as well.
Are you finished? Okay. We've got several questions lining up. We'll go back to the Deputy Director, Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, it might be more a question for someone other than the Deputy Secretary. What does it look like when you get a complaint on drift, and will this bill change how that might work? I recently had a communication with a constituent who has exactly that issue.
So this bill does not make any changes to how a complaint is brought to the agency. So someone who's calling in can bring forward a complaint either by calling us, and our staff will take the complaint over the phone. But we also have a website that is set up that allows for them to provide the information. It walks through where the location, where they believe, the damage has occurred, but it also says that they need to identify like who they believe may have been applying in the area and what they may have been applying. So once that is made, and if we are able to identify where we need to go and research or investigate, Kelly will send out one of her compliance officers or one of her inspectors to go and make an assessment at the location. They also take a sample of a material because our KDA laboratory will test that material to determine what residues are on those plants or that material that's been impacted. And then we go through a number of things that have to happen. So we have to look at the weather for that day because many of the restricted use pesticides require certain weather requirements. And we'll scan available weather data to determine what the weather conditions were like. They'll look at any of, depending if that was a business that made those applications, they'll look at their record keeping and their documentation. And we go through a somewhat lengthy process to determine if a violation of the pesticide label has actually occurred or not. And then at that point in time, if it's over a pesticide business, there is a summary order that follows. There might be violations, penalties that may be assessed, and it triggers a whole procedure process if there's orders that are subsequent to that violation.
Thank you.
I apologize, Deputy Secretary Olson. I called you Deputy Director instead of Secretary.
It's minor, no worries.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation, Deputy Secretary. I'm going to do it right. So.
Kelsey is just fine.
Question I have is how many violations did we have last year in this area, and how many repeat violations?
So we received around 70 complaints last year during the pesticide season. And those were varying different products that were being complained about. We are currently going through that process. That number is a little bit lower than we've had in the years, but we've seen fluctuations. I can remember during my tenure when we've had over 100 violations. But I do think our producers, our applicators are striving to do the right thing right now because there are a number of utilizing the restricted use pesticides is an important resource for our producers. And so adhering to the requirements that are out there is something I believe all are truly striving to comply with and do their best job so that we can maintain those tools in our wheelhouse for our producers.
Hey, so you said complaints. How many, what dollar figure did you actually assess a fine on somebody? I mean, these are in the regs. How did we use those?
So I don't have numbers on last year's seasons because we are still finishing up, following through. It is a lengthy process to assess those, but I'd be happy to bring some information on past years.
Or the year before, plenty of time. And I'd be interested in repeat violations because if a guy comes out and you assess a fine, the repeat guy should have known. So I'm just trying to get a feel of that.
Certainly. And Chairman, if you're comfortable, I'd like to defer to Kelly to take that question. She has that information available.
That's fine as long as we get a good answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. With respect to your question, I think it would be helpful. We have an enforcement matrix that we follow. And so each incident kind of depends on the facts of the case, which is not necessarily helpful to your question. However, if it's a general use product, those usually start as like a summary order because we want to have individuals have an understanding of the label, and we utilize that kind of as a compliance and education opportunity. When it becomes a restricted use pesticide, there's more potential to harm for the environment, persons. So those generally start at a civil penalty, typically around a $2,000 civil penalty. If it's a repeat violation, that also moves forward. And so essentially, we have a provision within our law that requires us at that time to go to the maximum statutory max, which is currently $5,000. That being said, as Deputy Secretary Olson stated, there is a process when we issue a civil penalty that there's a settlement conference and an opportunity to have a conversation and reduce that. Now, with respect to fiscal year 23, because we typically report on fiscal year rather than calendar year, and this is aggregate, this is all, not necessarily just complaint-driven, because we do find violations in those other inspections. In fiscal year 23, we issued 18 summary orders, and we issued 15 civil penalties. We did have a variety of other violations. So there was a temporary suspension because an individual didn't have certification, and that's a key component. We also had some cease and desist because they had businesses that didn't have a business license, so we were also ordering them to stop engaging in those behaviors until they get properly licensed and certified. Those penalties assessed looked like about $64,000. And then it ended up being paid out at about $31,000. Now, that being said, some of those penalties have defaulted. They did not request a hearing or a settlement conference through our agency, and so that unfortunately takes it a little bit out of our hands because we can't then have that opportunity for compliance and education in that manner.
So out of the 64,000, how much of that would be repeat violations?
I would have to get back to you on that information, but I don't have that in front of me today, so I'm not comfortable speculating what that would look like, but I could work with Deputy Secretary to get that.
Thank you.
If you would, please get that information to our staff. We'd appreciate that.
And I have a follow-up with the Deputy Secretary here. Surety bonds. Usually there's a dollar figure set to those. Do you have, there's nothing in here that talks about, that I see. Maybe it's there and I missed it.
Current law allows for $6,000 for surety bonds. And I believe that is the language that was also restored in 2607. I defer to Tamara on that.
So my question is that enough? You know, if there's something that really happens out there, and have you ever collected on surety bond?
I would defer to your guys's, I mean, I think we've gone around with industry and talked about what coverage surety bonds have. I mean, at one point in time, we were looking at removing them entirely because it was, of all of the financial responsibility that's provided to the agency, there's very minimal licensees that utilize that. I believe it's less than 20. And so we had looked at removing it entirely. However, there was support to it to put that back in. I would defer to your guys' judgment on what that level is. It is a very low level that was set several years ago.
Because I would question, Deputy Secretary, how often has that been used? You know, and should it be 50,000 versus 6? That's the thing I don't know. I understand the purpose, and you go try to get an insurance company to pay. Somebody's going to spend a lot of time chasing that around.
Yeah.
But I like the concept of what you're trying to do, because the other way is very complicated too, so.
I see Kelly behind you. She may have the exact answer. I don't have that information, if she can supplement.
We'll allow her. We do need to keep moving committee. We have additional questions and several more conferees.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to your question about do we go after the surety bonds, we do not. We issue a civil penalty when there is a violation. Typically, that's seen as being in play when it comes to be a civil matter. And so it's not necessarily something that we track or anything along those lines, because again, it relates to the civil case more than what we do with our violations of the Kansas pesticide law.
Senator McCann.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question has to do with the private applicator requirements, I know we've gone full circle. Farmers used to spray their own fields, then we had all the chemical companies come in and spray, and now farmers are gotten so big that they're doing their own spraying. Once again, when I get my bill for the commercial sprayer, it has wind direction, speed, everything. Does the farmer who's now farming across the road because they're big enough to own their rig, do they have to do the same thing?
Yes, if the restricted use pesticide label specifies those elements. If it does not make those specifications for wind and temperature, they would not, certified private applicators would not be required to maintain those records themselves unless required by the label.
Well, I think they should have to do whatever the commercial sprayers have to do. And lots of reasons for that. So my second question has to do with the form you fill out. And I think the last time I called the Department of Ag about wanting to turn in a report or a complaint, that once I started filling it out, you had to say who you thought the person was. Well, in my situation, it's either my neighbor that I don't want to upset, or it's my husband. And my point is, the complaint, I think, needs to be, you need to be able to turn it in, and the reason is, so I grow grapes, we also grow corn and soybeans, and when I call and ask about how many dicamba reports have happened, it's like, oh, we only had 2 this year. And I'm like, you would have had a lot more if we could just report it. And my purpose for reporting is because the EPA wants to ask you, or whoever's in charge of all those chemicals, they want to know what your complaints are. And I had some farmers tell me they don't complain because then they're afraid when the crop insurance adjusters come in, they'll say, oh, you did this. So it's really the chemical, and it's not because of the lack of rain or whatever. So I'd like to see from Kelly, I'd like to see if those reports have been updated, and I would like, send me the link of where it's at currently.
We'll certainly provide that information to you, and appreciate the feedback. Recognizing that filing the complaints, there's probably fewer filed than what are complaints that are actually out there.
It's more than just wanting to go sue my neighbor or my husband. It's really about making sure EPA knows what's going on out there. So I
Appreciate that.
don't know if Kelly can say they've updated that report or not, but if not, you just send it.
Yeah, we'll provide some information to you following this hearing regarding that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Committee, although I said we do want to keep moving, I do not want to shortchange any questions or information because I was warned ahead of time that this could be a lengthy hearing with a lot of questions, and we do want to make certain that everyone gets an opportunity to speak, ask questions. Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll make it quick. Follow up on Senator Fagg's question. How many of those 15 penalties were ag use and how many were non-agriculture use?
I don't have that. I would defer if Kelly has that information. We have that available. I don't have it. Oh, you don't have, okay. We don't have that today, but we'll provide that in a follow-up if that's acceptable.
That would be fine, absolutely. Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hopefully a quick question. I was just surprised that the fee maximum is being reduced from 45 to 35, starting in 2028. What do you know about the economy that I don't?
Nothing, I don't know. And I'm sorry, what?
On page 10, like lines 7 through 9.
7 through 9. That's existing language, so I would have to, I don't know what, I can't speak to that at this point in time. I'll have to get back to you on that. I suspect that we have some sort of sunset that changes unless it's extended, but I would have to verify for sure.
That's fine. I just would like the department to review that and make sure that that's what they want to be asking for.
That is an interesting question, and it is existing law, but it's still an interesting question.
I suspect we have a sunset in place, but I will verify that for sure.
Committee, additional questions of Deputy Secretary Olson? Seeing none, Deputy Secretary, appreciate you being here, appreciate your testimony. I will ask Taylor Williamson and Steve Hickok, is there a problem with either one of you being back on Monday if we should need to extend this into Monday? Okay. So we'll just continue with our agenda then. I know the rest of the conferees can easily be here. Our next conferee is Randy Stuckey, who is the Senior Vice President, General Counsel of Grain and Feed. And I realize I mispronounced your name on purpose, Mr. Stuckey, but.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Randy Stuckey this morning on behalf of Kansas Grain and Feed Association and Kansas Agribusiness Retailers Association. This is a broad bill. It's a very big bill, but as the reviser and KDA both mentioned, a lot of moving parts. Our focus on this is a couple of items. One is certainly we would implore the committee to move the bill forward with or without amendment, but the reason being that without this bill being passed and then some follow-up regulations by the agency, and I think this was mentioned, but the KDA is at risk then of losing their primacy, their authority then by the EPA delegated authority to regulate this area of the industry. We, the ag retailers, the grain elevators and agribusiness, do not want to be regulated by the EPA. Let's make that clear. Their civil penalty structure and criminal penalty structure is tenfold beyond what is set out in, what is reasonably set out in Kansas law. So for that matter, we want to work with the agency. We are working with the agency in passing this legislation to make sure that Kansas law and regulations remain substantially equivalent to the EPA's law under FIFRA and their regulations. So that's the point one. Should there need to be amendments to the bill, we would understand that. But moving forward with the legislation this year is critically important because the agency is under the auspices and oversight of EPA to do so this year. So that's point one. Point two has to do with the civil penalty amount that you'll notice was discussed in current law and has been for decades. The civil penalty authority by the agency over our industry, agribusiness, that means the businesses and their applicators, but it is the businesses that receive the penalty, is $5,000 maximum. It's been that way for decades. The amendment, the good faith amendment in the House was to reduce that because it was not bifurcated between, the language wasn't bifurcated to set out businesses versus individual applicators, both the employees of my businesses, members, and farmers. And so I think the proposed amendment that you'll find in KDA's testimony would do that. It would set out, it would maintain the historic $5,000 maximum civil penalty for businesses and then separately set out a maximum civil penalty for farmers and commercial applicator employees of the businesses. And those folks certainly aren't getting paid crazy money to apply pesticides, and they can't afford a $5,000 civil penalty. They'll go do something else for a living. I'm not saying that the KDA would, but we want to make sure that the authority is limited to civil penalties on farmers and employee commercial applicators. And that's what the KDA proposed amendment to this bill in front of you would do. So we would support that amendment. The last thing then, there was mentioned about, a question rather about the amount or the number of drift complaints, I think is the ask. And then the answer then was the 15. To be sure, okay, the Kansas pesticide law covers not just agriculture, but your lawn and turf, which means all of the golf courses, me when I apply pesticide to my front lawn. And so some of those 15 surely would have been lawn and turf companies, right? And even if it's not lawn and turf, you've got right-of-way by the various local governments. You've got the railroads that apply to their right-of-way. I mean, a lot of things outside of agriculture. And even for agriculture, these could have been personal protective equipment violations, record-keeping violations, not all of those were necessarily drift violations either. And on drift, when you apply pesticides, some of these pesticides can volatilize overnight due to the inversion of the temperature, and then invert into a plume and drift the next day when depending on the wind. So even if you follow the label of the law, the letter of the label, and apply when the temperature and the windage was right, the chemical can still volatilize and drift. And so that's an important thing to know too. It's not necessarily bad actors who violated the law repeatedly. There's a lot that goes into this, and we appreciate the KDA's good work on this, but just to kind of break down that civil penalty, those violations. Mr. Chairman, I'd stand for any questions, but that's kind of the meat of our support for the bill.
So other than the one amendment, which, by the way, you have attached your own amendment to your testimony, which is a little different from the KDA proposed amendment, other than that one change, the amendments by the House are acceptable or an improvement to the bill?
Yeah, we believe so, and I think the purpose or the intent of the language that I submitted and what KDA submitted were very similar, but we would defer to KDA's language on that.
Well, we shall see.
Okay.
Committee questions of Mr. Stuckey, Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senior Vice President, for your presentation. It's very interesting, what you had to say with that. This is kind of a pesticide 101 that you'd have a lot more experience than I would at this. There's surely levels of problems with that.
Right.
So my question is that as you look forward and something gets done and you got drift, what's the worst thing that can happen? Is it just, kill somebody's flowers, or is this something that gets on the ground that can be a big issue in the future? I just trying to decide what the level of seriousness here is what I'm trying to do.
So when you consider the level of seriousness, think about the role of the KDA as well. There's civil liability, and they carry insurance to protect for any civil damages, personal damages that can result because of the drift. And so KDA's role is really as like a police officer stopping somebody from speeding down the highway. They want to control that behavior. If you hit somebody with your car, that's a different issue and can be addressed separately through the courts. And so when we think about what can occur because of drift, well, it all depends on how much drift and onto whom, and that's why these chemicals, these chemical products are regulated so stringently by the EPA. It takes years and decades of review by the EPA before these chemicals are even approved for use. And then ongoing continual review, both for ESA, Endangered Species Act purposes, full environment, and effects to human health and safety. And so they can run the gamut, but it's really about the exposure, the amount of the exposure, and what the chemical is and what it is applied to. That determines the effect.
Committee additional questions of Mr. Stuckey? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
Committee, I did really want to hear, and we will get at least started with Representative Dr. Fred Gardner, because Representative Gardner has some personal experience in this area, and he is on the House Agriculture Committee, was heavily involved in some of the amendments. So, Representative Gardner, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, committee. I am Fred Gardner, and I'm the state representative from District 9. I am a veterinarian, and I've been involved in production agriculture for a very long time. My family moved into Kansas and began in production agriculture in 1870. We've been heavily involved since then, and I'm lived one of the most fulfilling and privileged lives and blessed of any person on this planet, because I've worked in that space all of my life, and almost all of it here in Kansas in rural areas. So it's very, very important to me. I'm not particularly a gifted public speaker, but when you elect public representatives, sometimes you end up with someone like me. So I will, in a matter of full disclosure, I am a licensed private applicator for restricted use pesticides. I took the training and received that license when that first came into law some years ago, and I have maintained that. I'll try to restrict my comments and thinking about this to what's good for the state of Kansas and not just what's good for me. But I do have some experience in this area. And although I've worked in animal agriculture for many years, since getting my license as a veterinarian in 1978, almost all of my rural customers are integrated producers of food, which not only includes animals, but other commodities as well. I have a deep personal, and also my district is very deeply involved in production agriculture. And this is very, very serious to me, but what a wonderful thing to be involved in. The state of Kansas, as we all know, has been the leader in the world in producing food, and not only food, but good food at a very affordable price, and that's fed this state and the nation and around the world, and a tremendous responsibility to feed 8 billion people every day. So all that said, I've been on this planet more than 7 decades, and I've seen a lot of changes come, including pesticides. Most of the pesticides we use today have come onto the market in my lifetime, and I've seen the benefits of those things. But we must keep in mind that EPA has a very important responsibility to protect our environment here in the United States, and we must acknowledge that that's very, very important, and they've played an important role in that. One example that I think about, when I was just a young kid, we gathered cattle to spray them with DDT to get rid of the horn flies, and it was wonderful. It really helped those cattle. But then we found out that DDT was accumulating in the environment and affecting birds, particularly the eagles and other birds, and causing thinning of the eggshells. And that product was pulled off the market. That was a mistake. We got it off the market, and we have recovered since then. But part of this bill, 2607, is to help prevent mistakes like that from happening again. So with that in mind, we all know that...
Representative, I'm going to need to interrupt you because of the time. Senate committees are not like House committees. We go from one right into another. We don't have a 30-minute break between committees. And if you don't mind holding that thought, then we will, if you're available Monday morning, pick up right there with you.
I could do that. I have just a few more remarks, but I would be glad to sure come back.
Well, I want to give the committee full opportunity to ask you questions, since you are an applicator and understand this industry and can speak from a Southeast Kansas country boy level, if you will.
And I was deeply involved in the amendments that came to this bill, and I think I'd like to speak to that a little bit.
Sure.
Thank you.
We look forward to it. So committee, we will suspend the hearing, and we will pick up. So plan on Monday morning. We will pick up on House Bill 2607, and we should be able to complete our hearing on Monday. We are adjourned.